York City, but she moved out to the middle of Pennsylvania where the hiking is better and the woods are significantly scarier. She's been writing for years, and her favorite feedback is when her mother asks, "Why would you write something so disturbing?" She loves to learn and once spent a week researching lighthouses just to write a historically accurate short story about one. When not writing, she's attempting to keep her garden alive, her dogs happy, and her partner from electrocuting himself when doing home projects. I know a little bit about that. So please join me in welcoming for the very first time, Kim Pinson.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to try not to yell into the microphone. So as someone from New York City, I talk loud and I talk fast. So I'm going to try not to talk too loud and not to talk too fast. But I am excited to be here and to talk about my book that I spent a lot of time researching and just talking about the misogyny about final girls and horror and where this all comes from. So Vicky already kind of introduced me, but I got into horror really young. My aunt showed me and my sister the entire Jaws series when we were like 5 and 6 years old. So if you want to have an eternal trauma for the ocean and never want to go into it, that's how to do it. You don't want your kids on sailboats? Show them Jaws. I don't go in the ocean anymore. So from there, I became a real lover of horror, and I just enjoy the genre a lot. And the whole reason why I decided to write this book to begin with was because I read a news article that said that horror is a terrible genre for women. They shouldn't watch it, they shouldn't engage with it, it's misogynistic. All that happens in it is that women get tortured and they die and they're objectified, so don't watch it. And I was kind of like, all right, well, Jaws didn't really have any of that. The other horror movie that I grew up with and watched way too early was Alien. I watched that at like 13, so imagine a little 13-year-old like this, as the chest burster is coming out of someone's chest with all the blood and everybody's screaming. I watched it with my sister also. She made me watch, so she didn't have to. But that has Ellen Ripley in it, who's probably one of the coolest final girls or women in horror that you could get. She survives, she beats up the alien in every movie that she's in. So I was kind of like, I don't really agree with this idea that horror is misogynistic. So I decided to go down the rabbit hole and spend 3 years researching this to say, can I make a better opinion? Is there something that I'm missing? So before we get into this, I'd want to just go over what does horror actually mean? Because you can get a lot of different definitions from it. The Latin definition means to tremble or shudder, which I guess if you're watching a horror movie and it's scary for you, you might tremble and shudder, you might grab onto your partner and be like, oh my God, let me close my eyes. Merriam-Webster also has a definition for it. I'm not going to read all of them, but it's basically kind of covering all of that. Something that's painful or dreadful or scary, something that's going to make you turn away and feel dread. If you ask an average person what they would define horror as, they're probably going to tell you that it's something that they're scared of. That's what I would define it as if someone asked me. I'd be like, the movie that's going to make me be afraid to go down into the basement when it's dark. While I was researching this, I came across an idea from Dawn Keatley, who wrote an article for Horror Homeroom. Because of course, when you talk to people about this, they're like, well, I don't like your definition of it. It's not very scientific. You can't just say something that scares people, because people can have a lot of different ideas of what scares them. What scares me may not scare somebody else. I know when the cicadas were around, I would not go outside. Because yes, I understand they're not going to bite me, they're not going to hurt me. I don't like them. They're scary looking. They got the wings, they crawl on you, they're crunchy when you step on them. No thank you. So I found this article by Dawn Keatley, and she compared 2 movies to say that what you need to have to make something horrific or monstrous is that you need to have a lack of choice in the movie, and there needs to be something monstrous. And the 2 movies that she compared is this one down here. Let me see if I can get the laser pointer. Frozen. So not the Disney one with Elsa. They're not letting anything go in this movie. And she compared that to another movie called Everest. Everest is based on the John Krakauer book, Into Thin Air, where he went up to he completed his summit to Everest, but a lot of people died because of the weather. And she said that when you look at these 2 movies, they both take place during the winter time in bad weather. However, in Everest, what is the monstrous thing? The mountain, the weather.
Fear of death.
Fear of death. I like that you guys are engaging. I'm so used to, I used to teach college classes, and I'm very familiar with the Gen Z stare that they talked about last week. And so I'm like, I would ask questions like that, it's just, I'm like, okay guys, I'll just keep going, but I'm glad that you guys are engaging.
The frozen bodies.
So the frozen bodies, so there is a lot on there that's scary. But that's if we're going to personify the mountain and the weather. Whereas if you look at Frozen, which is these people go on this ski lift, they get stuck on there overnight in the bad weather, and then there's these kind of horrific wolves that are trying to get them out of the ski lift. That's monstrous. That is out of the ordinary. A mountain that has bad weather that we really shouldn't be on to begin with is not necessarily monstrous. Then if you look at the lack of choice, all these people chose to go on the mountain. These other people didn't choose to get stuck on the ski lift and be subjected to these wolves that wanted to eat them. Because typically wolves aren't going to eat people. They are afraid of you. It's the same thing like with Jaws and Jurassic Park. A lot of people say that if you're going to call Jaws a horror movie, you have to call Jurassic Park a horror movie. I disagree with that. Partially because the sharks typically aren't going to try and eat you. You're more likely to get killed by a cow than you are a shark. So the fact that the shark is actively seeking out people makes it monstrous. Whereas in Jurassic Park, the tone of the movie is more, wow, look at these dinosaurs. Like, this is so cool. And then it goes into, Jeff Goldblum actually says it in the movie, we spent so much time thinking, can we, that we never thought, should we? So it's more about the awe of what's going on rather than the terror of being chased by these dinosaurs. At least that's my interpretation of it. I would never call Jurassic Park a horror movie. There's also certain cultural considerations when we're looking at horror movies and what scares us. And we're going to go into that a little bit when we talk about our very brief history of horror, because it goes back more than a century at this point. I cannot do math. So cultural considerations are also important because as the decades change and as our society changes, we are afraid of different things, and that often comes through in our film, and horror is usually the genre that will show that, because horror is usually the transgressive genre. Horror is usually the genre that people kind of ignore because they see it as lowbrow and not very important. So horror kind of gets its start in 1896 with this French guy, Georges Méliès, and he does this House of the Devil movie. Black and white, he did the coloring in it, and there's no sound. They don't even have the cue cards. So like in silent movies, you have the cue cards that every so often show up with some sort of dialogue. None of that. It's basically just one shot inside of a castle. It's like 10 minutes long, and it has witches and bats, and for that time period, it would have been scary. Nowadays, we might watch that and be like, oh, this is kind of silly and fun. Like, I'll show this to my 5-year-old. Back then, when movies were just getting started, the cultural considerations, this is something people had never seen before, this is going to be really scary for them. Once you move out of that, he did a couple other movies, A Butterfly Woman Who Gets Eaten by a Spider Woman. There's also one in a cave that deals with some skeletons that are in there and they're haunting people. Once you get out of there, we get into the 1910s, which is our literature decade. So basically, the people who are making movies here, we're taking literature and turning them into films. This is another medium, another modality to show these things in, so people who either didn't want to read or didn't have the time to read could now see these things on the screen for the first time. So this is where you get Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a couple of those other movies that are based on books from that time period. After that, we get into the 1920s, which is the golden age of horror and Universal's monster movies. So your monster movies are going to be The Wolfman, Invisible Man, Frankenstein, all those kind of movies. You also get Nosferatu, so he's probably one of the most memorable vampires with the big pointy ears and the pointy teeth. After that, you get into the 1930s, which is where horror is first used as a term to describe movies. Prior to this, movies that were considered horror were called dark gothics. I can't think of a single movie now that we call horror to be considered a dark gothic. I think if you went to somebody and said, yes, the Conjuring movies are dark gothic movies, they'd probably laugh and you'd be like, what does it even mean? So that's where you get horror. You also get Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein because they were really big during that time period, and what are you going to do with your one big property? You're going to put them with your other big property so you can get lots of money. You also get the movie Freaks, which is probably one of the most transgressive movies for that time period. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Freaks, but basically the director sets it in like a circus with a freak show. And instead of having actors portraying the freaks, he has actual people, so actual bearded women, actual people with amputations who are just, I don't know what the politically correct term is, but the freaks. They are actually playing those roles, and it ruined his career. Nowadays, if you had something like that, people would be like, oh my God, this is amazing, give it an Oscar. So less likely to ruin your career now because we're a lot more open to those sorts of things. The 40s, you had minimal horror movies, you had minimal movies in general. We were in the midst of World War II, so obviously a lot of our resources are going to be going to something that's a lot more important than creating films. You did get a couple of Universal Monster remakes, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir and Gaslight, which is a movie we're going to be talking about a little later. The 50s, we get, and like how I said earlier with how culture affects what we make in our films and our media, we had a lot of fears at this time of invasion because of Russia and nuclear war, again, because of Russia. So we have Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you have The Blob, you have Attack of the Crab Monsters. The Blob and I know, it's a very funny movie. It's kind of weird, giant crabs, but the two other movies, The Blob and Attack of the Crab Monsters, those things came out of nuclear explosions. So that was the explanation for where you get these things from. You also see Godzilla pop up in this, which I know is not an American movie until like the 90s, but obviously Japan is gonna have Godzilla because they were nuked twice. So they're gonna have even worse fears about nuclear explosions and nuclear wars than we're going to. You also see engagement with the audience. One of my favorite things about horror movies is that people engage with the media. Whenever you sit, not necessarily in a theater because you have to be quiet and respectful, but when you're home, who's yelling at the TV saying, no, don't go down into that basement, you idiot, don't do that, get out of the house. So this kind of is where you see movies engaging back with people. So there was a movie called The Tingler, and in theaters, they actually set up the seats to have animatronics in them. So at one point when the monster escapes, the seats would tingle you. And people lost their minds, running out of the theaters like nothing else. I would have left too. Goodbye, thank you very much. The person in the film even talks to those in the theater and says, hey, everybody, don't worry, I'm gonna get it back. So you see some breaking of the fourth wall, which they probably wouldn't have called it the fourth wall back then. That's a newer term. But it's kind of interesting to see that like even back then, they were so innovative with this kind of stuff. The 60s, we're having a lot of turmoil in America with fear of change, the civil rights movement, second wave feminism, and this brings up a lot of psychological and supernatural horror. So you get Night of the Living Dead, considered to be like the start of the zombie genre. You get Rosemary's Baby, Psycho and the Birds, because this is where Hitchcock gets his start. So you see a lot of that psychological horror, even a little bit of the satanic horror with Rosemary's Baby, because she is being basically gaslit into having the Antichrist baby. We'll talk about that again later. But more of the satanic panic kind of comes into play in the 70s and the 80s. So the 70s, you kind of get your slasher start and more monster movies. So you'll see the start of The Omen, The Exorcist. TCM is short for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's a lot of words there, and I didn't want to have to write them down. It gets tiring to do that. TCM's easier to abbreviate. Black Christmas, Halloween, Jaws, Alien. So those are probably a lot more familiar because those are a lot more in our cultural zeitgeist than some of the other ones. You always see references to those movies. Jaws itself is one of those where it's like, oh, don't go in the water, the shark's gonna get you. It just had its 50th anniversary this year. In the 80s, you get the sequels upon sequels and then more slashers because movie studios were like, hey, this makes money, let's do this. So you get your Halloween 2, Jaws 3 and 4, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. And then we kind of go into something that critics will call the doldrums. They think that the 1990s is the worst era or the worst decade for horror movies. I don't really understand why, because they said it's basically just remakes and sequels and it's not that interesting. But you also get Tremors, Misery, Silence of the Lambs, which swept the awards shows. You get The Blair Witch Project, which revolutionized the found footage genre, and which we still have now. I was terrified of that movie for the longest time. I didn't see it until about 6 years ago, when I was doing research for this, because I was so afraid the witch was gonna come get me. You also get Candyman, the wonderful Tony Todd is in that, and then Scream, which revolutionized horror as a genre in general. So if you're not familiar with Scream basically takes all the horror tropes and makes fun of them, but in a serious way. So one of the characters even says, you have to follow the rules of horror. You never split up. You can't say, I'll be right back, because then you die. So it brings all this in, and it's like, hey, we know that we're silly in horror. We know that we have this formula, but we're gonna use it to the best of our ability to make a good movie. After that, we get into the 2000 to 2015-ish era. Movies kind of take a weird turn here in America. You get what's called the torture porn genre and a lot of Japanese remakes. And from what I can see there is that we had just had, so right before Hostel and Saw come out, which are included in that torture porn genre, where it's basically like, we're gonna gore you out and make this as violent as possible without getting an X rating. Those came out right after 9/11. So people discussed the fact that because America had been so traumatized by watching 3,000 people die on live television for the first time ever, how else are we gonna scare people? What can we possibly do to make money through this? So they said, let's just gross people out. Let's torture people on the screen in the worst ways possible. And it worked. People love these movies. I personally, Saw is one of my favorite movies, only because of the twist at the end. The rest of them just kind of go off the rails. The Japanese remakes, I suggest that because we're so familiar with things that scare us in America, let's take something from overseas that we're not familiar with. So The Grudge and The Ring, both are evil Japanese spirits that we're not familiar with. So that is going to scare us more than something that we're familiar with. Then you also kind of have the horror comedies, which might be a reaction to that. Like, all right, we got all this gross stuff that's horrible. Let's make people laugh again about the horror genre. So that's where you get the whole Scary Movie series, Shaun of the Dead, and The Cabin in the Woods. Present day-ish, we have the elevated horror, which is stuff like The Witch, The Lighthouse, Longlegs. These are all fairly new movies. You get your extreme slasher, which is Terrifier. So this is kind of like your Saws and your Hostels. It's very gory just for the sake of being gory. You have your remakes. So Hellraiser, if anybody's familiar with Hellraiser, that was big in the 80s, and they just remade it. And then you have your sequels. So you have, this is like the fourth Conjuring movie, and then Smile had a sequel. So we're always doing sequels because they make money. And what do companies like? Money. So now that we've gone through the whole history of horror, the very brief history, because it's much longer in my book, I'm gonna have to not talk when I'm drinking that because that echoed. Who is the final girl? She's the one at the end of the movie who survives, which is basically the short version. That is Merriam-Webster's definition. She's the one who remains alive at the end of the film. She confronts the killer. So Laurie Strode, like in Halloween, or in all of the Halloweens, or Sally Hardesty in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Those are kind of your original final girls. And those are the ones that Carol Clover, this lady here, she's the one who actually coined the term final girl. Final girl did not exist as a term until she did it in a series of essays that she wrote. And she basically didn't like final girls. She kind of thought that they were objectified by the genre, they are way too traumatized, there's nothing good about them, they're sexualized, and they're basically just men dressed up as women. Because she said, these movies, which are mostly written, directed, and produced by men, they don't want to see their heroes be women. So they're going to make them as masculinized as possible and desexualized as possible. So she said that most of these final girls have masculine names, they dress conservatively, and they're supposed to be good girls. So one of those horror tropes that some of the more recent movies will make fun of is this idea that the final girl has to be a virginal good girl. So she doesn't drink, she doesn't do drugs, she always follows the rules, and she doesn't have sex. I hear a couple people laughing about that. So, do these ideas hold water? Is this true, what Carol Clover says? No, it does not. Any excuse to put Marissa Tomei on here from My Cousin Vinny. I love that movie. So it actually is not a valid way to decide who's a final girl. And I did this based on, so I picked 5 final girls from the 5 probably most popular movies from the time that Carol Clover was looking at her girls. So if you look at Laurie Strode up here from Halloween 1978, she uses drugs, she lies to adults, and she's not a virgin, according to John Carpenter, who wrote the movie. He said it's kind of an unfortunate connotation that people have made the connection that she was a virgin, but he said that was never intended in the film. So he said for that to be a trope for final girls should not be based off of his final girl. Then if you look at Sally Hardesty and Jess Bradford, they're both from the same time period, 1974, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas. Sally Hardesty is not nice to her disabled brother Franklin in the film. She's also hysterical and not masculinized. I don't understand why people say that just because someone's hysterical makes them a bad final girl. If I was being chased by a 7-foot-tall man in a skin mask with a chainsaw, I too would be screaming and crying and a little bit upset about my situation. Jess Bradford in Black Christmas, they're basically in a they're basically in a sorority house, and they're being tormented by this man who's calling them on the phone and harassing them, and then later murdering them. Well, remind me later. All right, so in the movie, she's pregnant. She's going to get an abortion, which the 1970s, that probably plays into that second wave feminism, that fear of women kind of having that bodily autonomy. And she's not listening to her boyfriend who says, don't do that, I want to have this baby. And then she also drinks. Very much not final girl behavior. She's not being a good final girl. She's having sex and she's not listening to her boyfriend, the man in her life. Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street is never masculinized. She wears pink throughout the entire movie. And she has a female name. Nancy in no way, shape, or form could be misconstrued as a male name. There's not even a nickname for Nancy that could be male-ish. And Wes Craven said that he specifically made Nancy as a character for his daughter because his daughter wanted a female character in horror that she could look up to. So that's why he made Nancy.
Not Nancy Drew.
Not Nancy Drew. Then you have Alice Hardy from Friday the 13th. She also doesn't listen to adults at this summer camp that she's supposed to be preparing for these children. She plays strip Monopoly and she's drinking there with her friends. So all final girls, they all live. Meanwhile, you have these two down here. Annie Phillips is from Friday the 13th. She dies in the first 20 minutes of the movie. She's super excited to go to this summer camp. She would be your final girl, good girl. She's that kind of person. Like, look at this nice little smile she has here. She's so excited to go. And then she winds up dead in the woods. Then you have Claire Harrison from the Black Christmas movie. She dies, again, within the first 20 minutes, is the first one to go. She doesn't want to drink, she doesn't want to do drugs, and she doesn't want to engage with the weird man on the phone. She said, we're all better off just going to sleep and not having a party. Again, typical good girl behavior. And she bites the dust. These are newer final girls. You can see up here, this is Sidney Prescott from Scream, that movie that kind of revolutionized the horror genre, where she's like, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I'm going to be a real person. I'm not going to fit into this caricature of what a final girl is supposed to be. I'm not going to read out all of these, but the running theme between them is that they're all having sex, they're doing drugs, they're drinking, they're being actual real people, as opposed to this archetype that Carol Clover seemed to believe that final girls should be. I also included these two on the bottom, Emerald and Naru, because they are both minorities, and you typically don't see minorities in horror to begin with. They're usually dying, not always first, because I went down that rabbit hole of does the black person die first in horror all the time, and it's not true. But part of that is also because there's not a lot of them in horror to begin with. So I think it's kind of neat that we're getting more of these minority characters in horror to begin with, because then you have more of the representation and diversity. So if the final girl trope that women have to be good girls and not do anything bad which could lend itself to the idea that horror is a terrible genre and it's misogynistic, isn't necessarily true, why might people think that the horror is misogynistic regardless of that? One of the reasons is something called the male gaze. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with that. It's kind of like an older term. It actually comes from a guy from the 1970s. It's kind of made a couple of cultural changes as we've gone along. So I have the whole definition in the middle there, but I'm not going to read it because it's a lot of words and it's confusing and I hate it. I think it's a stupid definition when you can just do this. Men are the subject of the movie, women are the object. Men make decisions, men do actions, women have the actions done to them. So that is essentially the idea of the male gaze, boiled down into two sentences. Men do actions, women receive actions. And that's part of what this male gaze is. Even though women make up 40 to 50% plus of the horror watching audience, most horror movies are still written, produced, and directed by men. So you're obviously going to get some of that male gaze. Not 100% because there are some men who do direct films with a female gaze, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But for the most part, you're going to direct or view something through the same gaze that you have as your person. So why are women so often objects in these films? And I have a couple pictures here that are basically male gaze coded. So I don't know if you recognize Paris Hilton, but she was from House of Wax. And the entire tagline of that movie was, "Watch Paris Hilton die." Where else have you ever seen a tagline like that? Who sits there and says, I want to go to this movie to see not just the character die, because her character was named Paige in the movie. You don't see that in any other movie. So why here? Why for the entire I Spit on Your Grave series, which is this one, a very male gaze coded picture, which is part of the rape revenge genre. Basically, a woman gets abused for the first 3/4 of the movie, and then she takes revenge on the men afterwards and goes on this killing spree to get rid of them all. Why this kind of picture? Why not her stabbing somebody? And then you have this, which is from The Last House on the Left, where it's another kind of rape revenge movie. That's his daughter. He's the one who goes and kills everybody. That part plays into the male gaze, where it's this male fantasy of, I'm going to protect everybody and I'm going to be this avenger and everybody else doesn't matter because I'm just going to do what I want to do. So these all kind of play into that male gaze because it allows men to, like I said before, be the actors. They get to be the ones doing the actions. Women in these films are just the ones that get those actions done to them. This last one down here is from the movie The Faculty, and I picked this one out because this character, for the majority of the movie, was dressed in black, and was kind of your punk rocker. Her hair was black. She was this whole just kind of like edgy character. But then at the end of the movie, in order to get the male jock's fantasy, she becomes this pastel, nice little dress-wearing girl who's now his girlfriend. So instead of her just being true to herself and being her own person, she's just an object that is manipulated throughout the movie until he gets what he wants at the end of the movie, which is a nice little girlfriend in a dress. And that all goes into this gaze, where the directors are looking at these women not as people, but as objects. So obviously that plays a lot into the misogyny that people would say is in horror movies. But what about if you have the male gaze, you have to have the opposite, which would be the female gaze. So what does this look like? If the male gaze is all about making women objects, the female gaze is about making women real people. So they take up space. She is, even though she's dressed in pink and she's kind of boy crazy, she is the center of the entire movie. This is Jennifer checking Jennifer's body. So basically she gets sacrificed so that this crappy band can become famous, and then she becomes possessed by a demon and goes out to murder boys, basically. There's a really neat line in there where the heroine of the movie says, "You can't do this, you're killing people." And she goes, "No, I'm just killing boys." Which is kind of that reversal of this male gaze, where it's like, well, boys aren't actually people. They're just things for me to do stuff to. You have Demi Moore here. She was in the movie The Substance, which came out earlier this year, which I thought was a good representation of how women are treated not just in media, but in life. Because her whole struggle in this movie is, how do I age and still be relevant in life? Because she's being pushed out by younger people. And you don't typically get that. In Hollywood, a woman's prime time is at best her 30s, but more so her 20s. Whereas you see lots of men like George Clooney and Harrison Ford. Like, Harrison Ford looks old as anything. Why is the man still acting? Because he's a man. Because it's okay for men to be old. Sorry, everybody in the room. I'm not trying to pick on anybody. I'm just saying what the research is saying. But it's okay for them. So this was a really interesting representation of what it's like to be a woman and to age gracefully while you're still kind of being like, man, I wish like I was 20 again. Like, what would I do with myself? Instead of just accepting who you are as that person. This was a really great example, or actually both of these are really great examples of the female gaze while done from a male director, because both of these were done by women. Jennifer's Body and The Substance. Gerald's Game and The Descent were both done by men, but the women were their own individual people. So Gerald's Game is actually a movie based on a Stephen King book by the same name. Basically, this woman, while trying to rekindle her sex life with her husband, is handcuffed to a bed. He dies. So now she's stuck handcuffed to this bed in this lingerie. This easily could have been a very sexualized movie. She's in a literal nightgown, like meant to be tantalizing. And yet the director does it in a way where you're more focused on her ability to survive being stuck to this bed and having some monster, and there's a dog too at one point that comes in and tries to eat her. You know, you're more focused on, oh my God, how is she gonna get out of this than, wow, she's in this nightgown, how pretty is she? And you have The Descent, which is an all-woman cast, and they go into a cave because they're trying to have fun and go caving and do all the things that, I don't know why you want to go into these caves and crawl through these holes and be in these claustrophobic situations. No, thank you. They wanted to do it, but they're all individual people. They all have they're friends with each other. They have their own goals and desires and concerns. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was the director was a British guy. So he gave all of the women different British accents, so Scotland and I don't know, they all sound the same to me. I'm not a good person with accents. But apparently they all have different ones. So if you've ever watched The Descent and you're good with accents, I guess you can try and pick up which different accents there are. But they're all individual people, and they're humanized. That is what the female gaze is. It's humanizing everybody in the film. It's not just about you're the object. So moving on, this kind of ties into the female gaze because it's like informal tests of whether or not a movie is misogynistic or whether or not it actually has any female characters. One of them is called the Bechdel test. So these are the rules for it. You have to have two named female characters. They have to talk to each other, and they have to talk about something other than a man. 80% of the time, horror movies pass this test. You know what doesn't pass this test too well? Romance movies. Because what's everybody talking about in the romance movie? Oh, that cute boy, I hope he likes me back. So they don't pass this test. It's a lot harder to talk about the cute boy in homeroom when you're running away from someone who's trying to murder you with an axe. You also have the sexy lamp test, which is, again, just an informal kind of test. I don't know if everybody recognizes the Fragile here.
I actually bought one for my son.
I've thought about buying one for forever, but I know it'll end up on the floor in pieces like the lamp in the movie. But basically it says that if a woman has no role in, if you can replace a woman in the movie with a sexy lamp, because usually like in action movies, the woman's really sexy in her skin-tight suit, and she's, oh, I'm so pretty. If you can replace her with a sexy lamp, you don't actually have any women in the film. You just have a set piece. If she has a role where her only role is to relay a message, she's a sexy lamp with a post-it note. Because all she's doing is giving a message to your hero. And you see that in a lot of action movies where the women are just kind of there to boost the man, or they're like, here, this is an important message for you from the alien country, and you now have to go and help them. So it's, again, they're both informal tests. They don't do like real research with them, but I think it's a good method to kind of see, like, does this movie have any real women in it? Do they have any real connections with other women in the films? Because that's what we're all kind of looking for. We want women to be seen as real people who have agency, and they're not just like a set piece. Oddly enough, with the Bechdel test, which is why you can't use it for everything, The Lord of the Rings fails the Bechdel test, which I find kind of amazing because you have Eowyn in that movie with one of the best lines of a movie where she's fighting the ring wraith. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Lord of the Rings. I'm probably just geeking out here on my own. But she's fighting the ring wraith, and the ring wraith says, "No man can defeat me," and she pulls her helmet off and she goes, "I am no man." So I just think it's kind of funny that those movies fail, but that movie will fail the Bechdel test, but you have such an amazing line like that where she's like, "I'm not a man, I'm a woman, and that's why I'm going to be able to kill you." So I had mentioned earlier this movie Gaslight from the 1940s. So if you're not familiar with this movie, it's basically this man is slowly making his wife go crazy by changing the gas lights in the house. So he's making them brighter, he's making them dimmer, and she's like, "Hey, are these lights kind of funny?" And he goes, No, you're just crazy." Hence the term gaslighting. So you hear that a lot now in like pop culture and psychology and stuff, of like someone who's purposely doing things to make someone go crazy because they're trying to manipulate them, and they're basically just trying to get one over on them. So you see that a lot in horror movies where typically the woman will say, "Hey, I saw this monster," or "This weird thing is happening. Don't you hear that rumbling up in the attic? Maybe we should go check that out." And then the other characters, typically men, say, No, you're crazy. There's nothing like that happening. You need to just go take some medication or take a nap or maybe go for a walk with your friends and everything will be fine. Obviously, you need some of that because you need to up the tension and anxiety in films, right? If they immediately believed the person, you'd have no movie. It would be over in 20 minutes. It'd be like, "Oh, okay, like, let's go kill the thing in the attic, or let's get rid of this evil Ouija board because clearly there's a demonic presence attached to it." But one of the other more insidious things we look at here is this just upping tension and anxiety in a film, or is it a reflection on how women are treated in everyday life? So what I point to with this is mostly the Me Too movement. When you look at Harvey Weinstein, and that, I forget what the guy's name is, the guy who was molesting the Olympic gymnasts, and he just went to prison for all of that. Something like that. His name's not important, he's a loser. He's where he belongs now. But basically, you have these women who for decades, and in some cases men with Harvey Weinstein, saying, "Hey, this guy is abusing people. He's abusing people. I've been abused. I've been sexually assaulted. I've been molested. Like, all these bad things are happening." And people are like, No. You don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy. That's not how it happened." And then you finally get someone who has some power, or when something bad actually happens that's really visible, now we're going to believe them. Which is basically reflected in horror movies. So in Rosemary's Baby, she's convinced that there's something wrong with either her or her baby or where she's living, but her husband and her doctor, the people she should be able to trust the most, are saying, "No, you're crazy. Nothing's wrong with you or the baby." Meanwhile, her husband and her doctor are in on this satanic cult that are trying to get her impregnated with the devil's baby so she can birth the Antichrist. You also have The Invisible Man, which is not really like the original Invisible Man from like the 1920s. She basically escapes an abusive situation with her husband. He pretends to kill himself, and then she's being stalked by him in his suit that makes him invisible. Nobody believes her because he's invisible. But she's like, "Hey, like, weird things are happening. Someone please help me. Like, my husband's still alive." But it's not until people die in public or other bad things happen, I think a house gets set on fire, that people are like, "Hey, maybe there's some credibility to the fact that her husband's still alive." So again, people who are in these situations that can sometimes be reflected in real life, especially situations like domestic abuse, like, "I need help." If you're like, "No, it's not that bad. You're just crazy. You're being dramatic." Not really being dramatic, especially with people like Harvey Weinstein. So that can be a consideration for why people view movies as horror movies as misogynistic. Women aren't believed in them. Kind of segueing into that a little bit, I know I mentioned the rape revenge genre a little earlier. That's one of the ones that's huge when people are like, horror is a terrible genre. Because who wants to sit there and watch movies like The Last House on the Left, where the women are abused for pretty much the entire movie and assaulted and beaten, and in this one killed, only to watch someone else get revenge for them, or to watch them get revenge for themselves. And then you also have the remakes. Oh, Straw Dogs was also one, I forgot about that one. These were both from the 70s. And the reason why these directors said that they decided to do those movies was because it was a reflection of the strife and the sadness and the stress and all the bad stuff that was happening in the United States in the 70s. So that goes back to like the race wars and the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the general societal upheaval that we were having in that time. My question then would be, how do these kinds of movies, these are the remakes, how do these kinds of movies actually reflect those things? What is it about women's bodies that these directors wanted to see abused to reflect the Vietnam War or race riots or societal upheaval? What was it? I haven't been able to find a really good answer. It just seems to kind of be an excuse to write these sorts of things. And the reason why I say that is because if anybody's familiar with The Brave One, which had Jodie Foster in it, her and her fiance were, it's a fake movie, but her and her fiance were walking through Central Park. They are attacked by just random violence by a group of people and beaten. So she survives, her fiance gets beaten to death. There is no reference to any sexual assault, nothing like obvious, nothing suggested. But she then takes this revenge aspect and goes and finds those people and kills them, and then just starts killing criminals. Why does this sound weird? Sorry, I got distracted by the sound. She then starts going and kills those people and then all of the criminals that are in New York City. So you have that really kind of sad, terrible, disturbing aspect of like this random violence, and yet you didn't need to sexually assault your main character. So that's why I argue that their argument that it's a reflection of society is not real. I think that that is a misogynistic opening to kind of write these films. And that's my opinion. I'm sure there's research that says I'm wrong, but this is my PowerPoint, and I'm going to say what I want. The interesting thing with the rape revenge genre is that you now have a lot of women who are directing these films and writing them and saying these are actually a good way for women to get catharsis from watching these movies. So catharsis is basically when you experience something that allows you to release your stress, your anger, your depression. So they say that when they write these films or when they view these films, it allows them to feel a measure of improvement within themselves because these women got to do something to men that they couldn't do in real life. Obviously, you can't go and hunt down a man and murder him. That's frowned upon. But in these movies, you get to see that happen. One of the other differences in these movies, which even though they're part of that rape revenge genre, that I think is an improvement from those other ones that we had, like these, is that the sexual assault is either not on screen or you really don't get much of it at all. So in these, Straw Dogs and The Last House on the Left, it's very graphic. You're almost like in the position of the rapist, which is kind of weird. I don't know why people like that or want to watch that. But that's where you take this point of view. Whereas in these movies, you never really see it, which I think is an improvement and why this is more of a female gaze as opposed to the male gaze of the other ones, and why I can kind of understand the whole catharsis element of it, which takes out some of that misogyny. So going into a topic, I know that's kind of a heavy topic, but going into something maybe a little more fun. Do women die more than men in horror movies? Yes? No? What do we think? That's okay. We say yes? Well, nope. It's kind of a trick question because a lot of people do think that women die more than men in horror movies. However, in a 1990 study, they found that when characters were attacked, women were 19% likely to survive the attack, whereas men were only 10% likely to survive that attack. And there's surprisingly little research on this, so I did my own. I picked 88 random movies and I tallied how many people died in them. And I found that 87% of the movies killed more men than women. So why might we think that women die more than men? One of the reasons is women's death in horror movies tend to be longer. They have longer chase scenes. They're more drawn out. Typically when a man's getting killed, it's kind of like, all right, here's the arrow through the chest, here's the knife across the throat, and now you're dead. Whereas the woman's like, okay, I'm gonna chase you and you're gonna trip and I'm gonna chase you some more and then I'm gonna hit you with the axe. Then you're still gonna get up and you're gonna run and I'm gonna hit you with the axe again. So you remember that a lot more rather than the simple knife across the throat, arrow through the chest, decapitation sort of thing. Women also tend to be considered like a protected class, especially in society, you know, the whole women and children first on the boats and the airplanes and all that. So like children, like dogs in movies, you're gonna remember when they die because you're like, oh my God, not the dog, not the child, not her. So that's probably one of the reasons that plays into why we think women die more than men, even though statistically it's not the case, especially when you have your final girl. They're gonna be the ones who are living at the end anyway. So with all of this, with the rape revenge genre, the male gaze, the extended chase and death scenes, why do women love horror? I had mentioned earlier that women make up 40% to 50% plus of the horror watching audience, depending on the type of research that it is or the type of subgenre. So why do women like it so much? It could possibly because that catharsis thing that I mentioned earlier, you know, you are just so angry that you can watch this movie and you can watch other people do these things and live in the moment and be like, yes, I wish I could beat Bob from HR over the head with a hammer because he's so annoying. He drank the last of the water from the water cooler. I don't know a Bob from HR, so I'm safe to say that. But you can kind of imagine that. You get to feel that way, and it's a safe way to do it, and then the movie's over. Or it's a safe way to just feel horror and terror in general. You know that whatever's in this television isn't going to come get you. Unless you're someone crazy like me who's convinced that The Grudge is still going to get me in the shower. And every so often I'm still kind of scared about it. I'm like, all right, is a little girl from The Ring going to come and stab me in the shower? But for the most part, you're safe from whatever's in the television. And you know that after 90 minutes to 2 hours, it's all over. You're not going to have to relive it again. You're not going to have to deal with it again. And if you hate it that much or if it's that scary or disturbing to you, you can always just turn it off. It's a safe place to experience this stuff. Women are also the main characters and protagonists of horror. So it's nice when you get to go and see a movie and you're like, all right, I know that I'm going to be represented here. I'm going to be the character that is going to be cool and is going to have the last word and is going to have the final part of the movie. I'm going to vanquish the villain. So that could be part of the reason why they like to see it. Even in a lot of action movies where the woman is supposed to be the main character, you often see the men kind of taking on that role or taking it from her. She's just kind of that sexy lamp with a post-it note. So, the whole point of this was, is horror misogynistic? And I know I kind of went over a lot of stuff. And what do we think the answer is? Yes? Okay. That's what a lot of people say.
Maybe the older ones are, and the older
Maybe.
ones are, and the newer ones aren't.
That could be it. That's kind of where I think. So that's why I say, what if I told you it depends? Got a little Morpheus in there. So, I think that's it. Yeah. So, it depends. So it could be the older movies are more misogynistic. You see a lot more nudity, especially female nudity in there. A lot of the newer movies, you're getting more male nudity. One of the chapters that I have in my book, it's kind of like a tangent chapter, is it illegal to show a penis on television? Which surprisingly it's not, but there are a lot of rules related to that, which I also thought was weird. But you see a lot more male nudity in the movies nowadays, whereas in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s-ish, you really wouldn't. It also depends on what kind of gaze you're bringing to the movie and your own viewpoint that you have. So you may be looking at a movie differently than the person sitting next to you. So you may be getting something completely different out of it than somebody else, which is why it's such a hard thing to nail down, and why, even though I've watched a lot of those movies, including the horrible Last House on the Left series, I still kind of say, you know, I like horror. I don't think it's that misogynistic, even though there are some that are. but it depends. So that is it for me. Thank you guys for coming. I love talking about this subject. It's my child. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it, even if you maybe don't watch horror movies, or maybe you'll go and watch something spooky this Halloween season. Alien is always a choice.
Are most of these on TV, like streaming?
If you have, like, I know AMC is streaming a lot. They just did the whole Nightmare on Elm Street series this weekend. I think they're going to be doing Freddy and Jason and Halloween coming up. Freeform, which is the Disney version, they do a lot of the less scary movies. So like Nightmare Before Christmas, Hocus Pocus, I guess The Witches of Eastwick. But I mean, those are still good movies to look at too. I mean, Hocus Pocus, you have these three witches who are obsessed with the virginity of a small boy. So you kind of get the virginal aspect there because they need him to make them young. So yeah, they're usually on cable, especially this time of year.
Kim, you think Stephen King was, how did he treat women, his main character, Stephen King?
I think Stephen King hates women and children. And I say...
At the end, they made up, though.
They do. It's been a while since I've read a Stephen King book. I was obsessed with him when I was younger. I was like, I want to read and own every single Stephen King book. But then I must have read too many of them back to back because I felt like they were very formulaic after a certain time period, because they all have like a writer. They all have the child that is the bad child just because he's a bad child. And I was kind of like, all right, like, I'm not really into this anymore. And then I kind of felt that even though they do make out at the end, he's kind of like unnecessarily abusive to them. Kind of like in the vein of Last House on the Left or one of those. I know that's it's not a popular opinion. I still like some of his books. Like I really love Misery. I love The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. The Stand. No, not. Yeah, The Stand. He's got a lot of really great books. I just don't feel that he likes women and children. Yes.
Have you seen almost every horror film?
Oh no, I have not. I've tried to watch as many as possible. I watched a lot for this because I wanted to be as educated as possible. In my book, I have a whole section of the movies that I did watch, and it's over like 200 at least. But there's always more to watch. Like I still haven't watched the new Conjuring movie. I still haven't seen White Zombie, which is from the 1930s. I haven't seen the original Frankenstein. So there's just so much out there, and some of them you kind of get spoiled because everything's on the internet now. So it's kind of like, all right, I don't want to watch this anymore because I already know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I see you too.
Do you really consider Silence of the Lambs a horror movie?
Oh, so that is really a really interesting idea because it was originally billed as a horror movie. Oh, I have to repeat the question? Oh, I'm sorry, everybody. I was not given that instruction. So I will now repeat every question. Do I consider Silence of the Lambs to be a horror movie? I do, even because originally it was billed as that. And then when it won all of those awards, it was basically recast into being a thriller, which annoys me to no end. And the reason why I say that it's a horror movie is because if you're looking at the tone of the movie, it's meant to scare you. It's meant to be upsetting and disturbing. Even though you can kind of look at some other maybe cannibal movies where they're not like that, or some of the other even Hannibal movies where they're more kind of thrillers. But the tone is to scare. When Clarice goes down into that literal dungeon to go meet Hannibal Lecter for the first time, it's scary. It's not that kind of thriller thing where it's like, I'm this cool lady and I'm gonna walk into this place and I'm gonna own everything. She's scared as hell to be down in there because she's this new FBI agent and she's looking at these guys like, oh my God, like, these guys are crazy. And then she gets to Hannibal Lecter and he goes, hello, Clarice. And he does that weird tongue thing. So that's why I consider it basically because of the tone to be a horror movie, and that seems to be what the director's intention was, and then it was changed because Hollywood doesn't really like horror movies. You see that a lot when something wins an award. It goes from being a horror movie, it's a thriller now. It's a mystery. So.
What does your husband think of your obsession with horror movies?
So the question was, what does my husband think of my obsession with horror movies? He actually loves horror movies too. So we bonded over that. He hated them by the end of this research project because I was like, all right, we're gonna sit down and watch these 3 horror movies now. And he's like, do we have to? And I was like, yes, you must sit with me. But he loved, his favorite movie is the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And he loves to just sit and watch these things. And I brainwashed him a little because at one point we were watching the original Nightmare on Elm Street. And he goes, see, look at this. Why does Freddy's hand have to come up in between her legs in the bathtub? It would be much more scarier if it was a man in that position because they're always abusing the women. Put a man in the bathtub. And I'm like, yes, you've learned. I think, you have a question?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm so impressed with your insights into this. I suspect if one went to film school, there probably are whole courses in horror films. But are these all your own insights?
So a lot of them are my own insights. Some of them is what I've built into my insights. Repeating the question. The ADHD gets to me. I'm just like, go, go, go. So the question was, are these insights all of my own, or did I get these from somewhere else? So some of them are going to be my own, but I think it's also impossible to do research and watch these movies without kind of absorbing the insights and ideas of others. So I can't take credit for all of it. I'd like to think a lot of it is mine, but also like I've been influenced by a lot of what I've read and a lot of what I've seen, and then of course the people that I talk to. So I have coworkers at work that I usually find at least one, and I'm like, did you see that movie? And like, we'll talk about horror movies together, and we kind of mix and match our ideas. So it's not entirely me, but it is also me. Yes?
Right, this is just an example. One of my memories from being in high school. One of my memories from high school was when I went on a date with a guy and another couple. We went to see Psycho, and in the middle of the movie, well, at the shower scene, I felt this limpness go next to me, and my date had passed out.
Oh my God. And Jamie Lee Curtis said her mother never took another shower again, ever.
But that goes to what I said about Jaws. You sit there and you say that I will not go in the ocean because of Jaws.
Speaking of Psycho, if you ever get a chance to watch it, mute it. Mute it when that shower scene is on, because all it is just this. It loses the total effect of being scary. It's the music that.
And the Hershey's chocolate syrup.
Yes, it was Hershey's chocolate syrup. And just as a side note for the tonal music, so is everybody familiar with the Three Stooges?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so, and now I've got you guys. So I love the Three Stooges. My dad had us watch that all the time as kids. They've done research where the Three Stooges is funny, mostly because of the sound effects. So they showed a group of people the Three Stooges with and without side effects, and as much as you can categorize how much people laughed a lot more with the sound effects. So I think it's amazing how much sound can affect how we react to media and how important musical score is, how important all of that stuff is, and how when something doesn't have music, so there's a movie called No Country for Old Men. There is not a single musical score in that whole movie. It is just the effects from people doing stuff in the movie, but there is no music. And it's amazing how when you realize there's no music, how unsettling that is. Because we're so used to having the musical score in the background. and how that affects our moods and how we're reacting to the media. Oh, that's a whole totally different topic, but I think it's amazing how that stuff works with us.
Is The Exorcist a horror movie or a thriller?
So the question is The Exorcist a horror movie or a thriller? I would say The Exorcist is definitely a horror movie. It deals a lot with those fears of Satanism and just a lack of control that we have, because Reagan is, I'm still not quite sure how she gets possessed by Pazuzu, but she gets possessed by Pazuzu. And then it's just, nobody can help her. She goes through to science. Science runs all these diagnostics on her and all these tests. They can't figure out what's wrong with her. They're sticking all these needles into her. They're putting this small child through all this pain and nobody can help her. And then at the end, it's like you get the priest in and he's trying to help her. And even that is kind of like, is the good guy gonna win here? Because the demon's just so strong. But yeah, definitely a horror movie.
The book is better than the movie because I think you can think in your mind what's happening when you read the book rather than visualize it on the screen.
So she was saying that the book is better than the movie because you can visualize for yourself rather than seeing it on a screen. And I think in some cases that's true because our minds are our own worst enemies. Usually what we can imagine is worse than what they can put on the screen. So a lot of times if you see a PG-13 movie, I sometimes like those better than the R-rated movies because even though the violence is at a minimum, you have to imagine that. Like you have to imagine what this person is doing and what's happening to them as opposed to them just being like, okay, like they got their head chopped off. Meanwhile, you're imagining like, oh my God, what happened? So, do we have any other questions? You guys are so good. I love talking to you. Yes.
The bad seed, I saw that when I was very young, and that has haunted me ever since. Is that a horror movie or a thriller?
So I'm not familiar with the Bad Seed. See, like I said, I haven't seen every single horror movie. Okay, so I'm gonna have to add that to my list. If it's on streaming, I'll be able to watch it right away. Otherwise, I'll have to see if I can get it from the library. I try not to pay for stuff. Because like, you already pay for cable and the streaming services. Why do I have to pay for more movies? But
The plot of that movie, it's nature versus nurture.
okay.
This little girl is adopted, and she reminds me of Eddie Haskell in Little Ginger. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
She's so sweet to her mother. Oh, I have the best mother. I have the best mother. She's awful. She'll kill people. She does all of these things.
It's a
And
bad seed.
her mother starts to suspect things, and the whole point of it is she's adopted. And her mother was bad. So did she inherit that bad seed, or is her adopted mother bad? So it's nature versus nurturing. Yeah, it's scary.
Okay. So and again, so Vicky was saying the plot of the movie with the child's adopted, and was her mother the badness that got put into the child, or is it how she's nurtured, which is always a thing. They do a lot of twin studies in real life, where twins who are separated, I know so much random stuff, but twins who are separated, they'll be like, well, this twin went on to be like a computer engineer, and this twin went on to end up in jail. So was it because they were raised differently? Was this one just predetermined to be bad? And basically, they're not entirely sure. It's kind of like we think it's a little bit of both. Because even when you have two kids growing up in the same household, like my dad he's one of 7 kids. And each one of them is so very different. But they all grew up in the same household with the same parents, the same upbringing, as much as you can with 7 kids, because usually like you're really super strict with the first one, and then as you go, you're kind of like, all right, like the youngest one will be fine. Sure, they fell down some stairs. Rub some dirt in it, you'll be fine. Yeah, go jump off the roof. Have fun, get out of my hair. But they're all so different. So I think you kind of get a little bit of both. And just going back to the question of, is it a horror movie? Is The Bad Seed a horror movie? That kind of plays into, what is your perception of it? Does it scare you? What was the intention behind the film?
I think something like The Bad Seed is horror in your mind because it could happen to you or your child, whereas you're not going to get attacked by a gorilla in real life. It's something that could happen. right? You could have a child like that.
Yeah,
Scary.
getting attacked by a gorilla, unlikely. Having a child attack you, it's more likely.
However, we didn't have each other.
What about the birds? You didn't mention that.
Yeah, that was.
So that was from the 1940s. I would still consider that a horror movie because it's taking, so the question was, what about the birds? Is that a horror movie? Yes, because you have, if we're going back to that definition of monstrous and lack of choice, you're typically not going to get attacked by a flock of birds. You know, you sit there with your binoculars, your bird watch, there's the yellow-breasted finch, and there's the cardinal, and there's the blue jay. You're not going to have to worry about them suddenly flocking out of the trees and pecking you to death. Or the seagulls. Yeah.
Seagulls are something different.
Seagulls are tiny demons. They're not actually part of the bird family. They are little possessed creatures. They're not meant to exist.
They'll attack you.
But, but typically you don't have to worry about birds. So that's what makes them monstrous in that movie. That's what lends itself to being horror.
One last thing.
Okay.
I think you should have a category for gore.
A category, like a subgenre?
Yeah, because I don't like gore movies. but
I'm
I
like this
scary
already.
television.
So category for gore, there's, they call that like the extreme slasher genre or that torture porn. So your Hostel, your Saw, Terrifier, there's a bunch of others. I don't really watch them. There's some movies that I will never watch because they're meant to be that disturbing. And there's, to me, in my opinion, there's no reason to have ever made them. There's a movie from the 70s called Cannibal Holocaust. It was actually considered to be one of the first found footage films, but it included, there was a lot of rape and just violence, and then they killed real animals in the movie on screen. Like they pull a turtle out of the water and they just butcher it right there. I don't see the reason for that movie. The only interesting about that movie is the director wanted it to seem so real because it was shot as if it was a documentary. The director asked the actors to go into hiding for a year after the movie was filmed to make it seem like it was real. Well, this director was then brought into court in Italy where he lived for the murder of those actors. And he was put on trial, and he had to be like, no, they're still alive. Let's get them in here because I'm not going to the jail for the murder of 3 or 4 people here. That's not what happened. But I think that was an interesting little side note to the Cannibal Holocaust. Awful movie. Do not recommend watching it. It's disgusting, but it has an interesting historical footnote there. Any last thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? Concerns can go to Vicky. All right, thank you guys, it was lovely.